the Kremlin actually missed, I think, its window of opportunity back in February. And it kind of meant that certain Trump officials who know what the Kremlin's up to, they got the space to, and again, I think it was Kellogg who's still there. It's Waltz who's off at the UN now. And I think Marco Rubio's sharp enough to know what's going on. But Rubio he can't front up against Trump because he knows what Trump does to secretaries of state who he doesn't like what he did with Rex Tillerson back in 2017, and because Marco still might want to run for president in 2028. So there are limits here. But if you then flip it and say, well, who are the other people who are very much Vlad's big defenders within the White House, beyond Trump? JD, who wants to be president in 2028, JD can't go all in with the Kremlin. He can't, right? He just can't, because there's that segment of the Republican Party who are very suspicious of doing that. And Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer and purported envoy, well, eventually he's going to go back to playing golf with Trump and nobody's going to remember him.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Scott is also the founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hey, it's fantastic to be here with you, Louis.
Well, Donald Trump claimed yesterday that negotiations would start immediately on a ceasefire after this phone call with President Putin, but Russian media claimed Putin is willing to work towards a memorandum of understanding. How should we read into that phone call?
How you should read those opening statements is put them to the side and talk about what really happened by going into the detail of the statements, especially Putin's. Here's what went down in that call. Don calls up Vlad, goes, hey, Vlad, do you love me? I mean, do you love me? Vlad goes, oh, yeah, sure, yeah, I love you. Yeah, I love you. And Dad goes, no, really, do you love me? Vlad goes, yeah, I love you. Don goes, okay, I need you to do one thing for me, Vlad. I need you to talk to Vladimir. And Vlad says, okay. Okay. For you, I'll do that, Don. But first, I'm going to make Vladimir giving me all his lunch money, and I'm going to keep beating him up until he does so, right? Okay, let's make two fundamental points. And I know that your great series Frontline has talked to Bill Browder, who's on this as well. But let me just emphasize this. One, Putin made it very clear, and his statement came out before Trump's, and that's significant. The Kremlin went on the front foot on this, no ceasefire. The way they couched it is they said, all right, if we get all the arrangements with Ukraine agreed, everything agreed, then we ceasefire, okay? That, of course, is knocking back what's really worrying the Kremlin and the reason why they had this call with Trump, which is that Ukraine and Europe pushing the 30-day ceasefire initiative. Putin was unable to push that to the side last week with the sham Istanbul talks. So now he's got to get Trump one-on-one. Okay, secondly, probably even more important, is that Putin maintains his demands for Ukraine's surrender, effectively the ultimatum. And the phrase that he uses for this always is that the main thing is that we remove the root causes of this conflict. Now, the Kremlin has used this phrase, root causes of this conflict, for many, many months. And what they mean by this is that they frame this to say, we have to maintain, in fact, we have to get the annexation of 4 Ukraine regions plus Crimea, which they've occupied since 2014. Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south. Russia doesn't even control all of those 4 regions. Ukraine has significant parts of 3 of them. But what Russia says is Ukraine has to pull back and give us even more territory. Otherwise, the root cause of the conflict remains. Russia says, of course, you have to lift sanctions on us. And that's something that was tipped off in the readouts yesterday, especially Trump saying, oh, once we solve this, we have this great economic future with Russia. It's going to be wonderful. And we'll trade with Ukraine as well. But Russia's also looking for Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, which is not taken over by them, to be demilitarized, to be kept neutral, and to have no significant security links with the West. No NATO membership especially, but also no significant military assistance or relationship with Western militaries. That's their long-standing approach. that they've taken ever really since autumn 22, when Ukraine prevented them from overrunning the entire country with their counteroffensive. And Russia says, all right, we're going to take part of it, and we're going to keep the rest of Ukraine weak. That's where we're back to, at least with Vlad and Don. The question is, will Vladimir take his beating? And of course, the answer is no. And that brings in the other kids on the playground, the European leaders, who a lot of the coverage yesterday kind of pushed to the side. But I would argue they're now at the forefront of what happens next.
And there was also no confirmation of a meeting between Putin and Trump, which Trump had been floating the idea of for the last week. Will Kiev actually be breathing a sigh of relief over that they're not going to have Putin and Trump going over their heads in a bilateral meeting?
No, because everybody knows that's the Kremlin holding another card in their pocket, right? So if the adults in the room in the Trump administration continue to work with Europe and with Ukraine, and remember, in the last few weeks, through those adults in the room, the U.S. has lifted the suspension on military aid to Ukraine in a small way, but it's still significant. That certain U.S. officials, especially Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, are discussing some provisions for Ukraine's security. And beyond the Trump administration, that you've got Republican legislators led by Lindsey Graham, who are now pushing for toughened sanctions on Moscow. Now, the Kremlin doesn't want any of that. So their ultimate card is to give Trump his face-to-face with Putin.
And is there enough movement outside of the White House? You know, we talk about the Congress and people like Lindsey Graham who are pushing to continue that support for Ukraine. Can they make that meaningful for Kiev?
They can't make it meaningful, and I think the press has missed this one, right? Because if you go with the simple math of this, let's say you get a sanctions measure which is adopted by Congress. Now that does mean that the Senate has to get the House to come along, and the House has more Trumpists. But let's say they get that measure across. Trump is in the position where he either has to accept it or he has to cast a veto. Now, if he casts a veto, he's splitting with the folks who have kept him in power. And of course, if he accepts it, Kiev's on the up. Now, there's quite a way to go in terms of that scenario playing out. But in the meantime, what you get is the symbolic effect that Trump does not have unified Republican support for this pushing aside Ukraine and Europe and going direct with the Kremlin. Far from it right now. And I think that pressure is only building in Washington. It's overshadowed by other issues. But again, the very fact that Lindsey Graham was in Istanbul last week when those talks were going on was showing that for him and his group, and it's a significant group of senators, this is a priority issue.
So has Trump got enough out of his phone call? At what point do people in the US and Europe really start to question his ability on the world stage and just move on without him?
Well, I mean, the whole thing about Trump is that Trump doesn't have to deliver something. He just simply has to throw another ball in the air, and hope that people watch that while it crashes. And within 24, 48 hours, we could be talking about tariffs again. We could talking about another attack on another agency. They could be using the Biden distraction, given the revelation he has cancer, to bash the Democrats, which regrettably some Trump spokespeople are doing. In other words, I think Vlad and Don here, even though Vlad doesn't really love Don, by the way, just spoiler, I think they are linked by this, and that is that Putin has to string this along, and he strung Trump along, right? Which is all right. Yeah. We'll talk, and that gives him more space to continue the attacks. Not even, I think, as much the frontline attacks in the east, where the Russians are starting to slow down, but the missile and drone attacks. He gives them the space to do that, and it gives Trump the domestic space, not the international space. Everybody knows what he does, but he gives him the domestic space to say, "Oh yeah, I'm still working on this. I'm still working on it." Right, and eventually, I think Americans will get tired of it. By the way, I think some Americans are realizing he's not going to solve Israel-Gaza on another front. Eventually, they'll tire of it, but not yet. So he buys himself a bit more time. Vlad gets a bit more time. And then you have to see where Europe and Ukraine can actually do the serious lifting to maintain the resistance against the invasion.
And I want to come on more to Europe in just a moment, but before that, where does all of that leave the White House specifically? Who's going to be on side with Trump on this and these supposedly immediately starting negotiations inside the Trump team?
Oh, his real estate developer and purported envoy Steve Witkoff. I mean, Jesus, like Witkoff, who also loves Vlad. Now he can't have Vlad because Don has Vlad, but he loves Vlad. He's had 4 meetings with Vlad. He was hoping to get the 5th after Istanbul, and that didn't happen because, of course, the Russians sent a low-level delegation and kind of pulled the whole thing down. So you got Witkoff there, but Witkoff doesn't really have that much heft. So let's talk about the key players here. First of all, you talk about the Defense Secretary, Pistol Pete Hegseth. Christ, Hegseth is just like this non-entity when it comes to anything serious, apart from his photo opportunity in the Gulf when Trump was out there a few days ago. You're talking about a vacuum right now at the National Security Agency since Mike Waltz, who was more of a backer of, some security for Ukraine. He gets pushed aside. So you're really talking about Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine. You're talking about Marco Rubio, who's Secretary of State. And I think Rubio, who a lot of people have put down quite rightly for playing, almost like this retreating Homer Simpson figure, right? In the first months of the Trump administration, I think Rubio working with staff and with Kellogg have been saying, look, we can't go all the way into the pocket of the Kremlin, right? So he's maneuvering with his own position kind of in between support for Ukraine and the position with Vlad. But the person I'd be watching is the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, which might sound really strange. He's a money guy, right? Remember this, one of the key markers in the past few weeks was that minerals deal. Now, the importance of the minerals deal was symbolic. It's not practical because you're not going to get those minerals immediately, but it was symbolic that the U.S. has an interest in Ukraine. And to have an interest in Ukraine, you can't let Russia overrun it. Well, Bessent was the guy that was driving the final stages of that deal. And just as Bessent has been, I think, the key player on tariffs to kind of limit their damage so far. If he's involved in terms of saying, no, we're not simply going to open up full-scale trade with Russia and carve up the world, sacrificing Ukraine, then that becomes significant as well.
And Zelensky has instead proposed the idea of wider talks, bringing in not just the US and Russia, but also European partners. How's it going to look for the White House if Trump alone, as he promised, can't bring peace to Ukraine, but a European alliance can?
Well, look, Europe's not going to bring peace. What we are talking about, so let's shift this to where we are now, right? There is not going to be a ceasefire in the near future. There's not going to be a Ukraine surrender in the near future. How many times I've used this phrase, and I wish I hadn't quite used it. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And we're back onto the next mile of the marathon, or kilometer for you Brits. Wait a minute, no, you could say mile as well. Kilometer for you Europeans out there. There we go. So, we're on to the next kilometer, stroke mile. And it's going to be, look, can Ukraine get enough assistance, financial assistance, where the government maintains its authority, maintains services? Can it get enough diplomatic assistance where it doesn't have to accept the Russia ultimatum? And can it get enough military assistance where it can hold the front line to a large extent, which it has in the past few months, and where it can maintain its air defenses against the missile and drone attacks, and where it can counterattack with its own strikes inside Russia, which have caused some damage to Russia's military capability. You play that out now in the longer run, and then we have the question beyond it on the economic front, which we've had for more than 3 years, which is Russia's own economic capacity. Not, is Russia going to collapse economically? That's never what we were talking about. But can they maintain the amount of resources that they have to this assault to try to break Ukraine? Can they continue to do it to the same extent over the next year?
So what is there then in the short term we should expect or maybe hope to see from Ukraine's European allies?
The signal from European leaders, and here when I talk about European leaders, it's Germany's Friedrich Merz, who's just come in as chancellor. Very, very big shift in German policy to give much more overt support for Ukraine. It's Italy's Giorgia Meloni, who was in on the conference call with Trump yesterday, that also included Zelensky. It's France's Emmanuel Macron, UK's Keir Starmer. Those leaders, as well as, of course, the European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen, right? What they signaled last week is if Russia does not agree to the ceasefire, and if it does not agree to real talks, not the sham talks that we're talking about, there will be a new EU package, which could be adopted as early as Tuesday. Now, that will include effectively sanctions, but it pretty much rules out the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. Now, that's really significant because, of course, these were the gas pipelines that were, very much running from Russia to Germany. They were part of Germany's significant energy dependence on Russia. We always had the question as to whether Germany would give that up. That question's been running for years, even before the full-scale invasion. And now what they're saying is no. The sanctions go on Nord Stream 1 and 2 because, of course, what Europe has done is it's retrenched to significantly cut its dependence on Russian gas supplies. You also have more sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet, and that's now being justified in two ways. One is, of course, you do that to curb Russia's oil revenues. And secondly, you do it because the shadow fleet has been involved in the threat and indeed the attacks on the undersea cables up in the Baltic Sea. You put more sanctions on Russian financial institutions to curb Russia's ability to trade, right? You start to consider, I don't think the confiscation of Russian assets yet. Merritt's again still holding off against that, but he said it is a possibility. I think what you see is that you get more devotion of profits from the Russian assets, and that's about 3 billion euros of Russian assets that are held. Those profits being going to Ukraine, right? That all goes in there. And then remember beyond that, and this is the huge question, the first phase of Ursula von der Leyen's 800 billion euro investment over 5 years in European defense production, that is now rolling out. That's 150, 160 billion euros. Do they successfully fund that and boost the defense production both inside and outside Ukraine? So there's multiple fronts here. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize this. Europe cannot replace everything that the U.S. has provided to Ukraine, right? Europe cannot provide it. But Europe can do a significant amount because I think we started this year thinking that if Don professed his love for Vlad, that was going to be it. And what we've seen is it's not, is that in fact, Ukraine is not completely dependent on the U.S. to maintain its resistance. And not just Europe, but other countries as well. Because remember, there are others that are involved, Canada, Australia, other Asian countries. If they maintain support for Ukraine, well, the marathon continues.
And you talked about the worry that a lot of people had that the US would simply abandon Ukraine. JD Vance has been in Europe over the last few days. He has again reiterated this idea that the US could walk away from the conflict. I suppose there's two scenarios there that emerge. One, Trump stops getting involved, but Congress and support outside of the White House continues. Or the US simply stops all support for Ukraine completely. What do either of those scenarios mean for Trump? Because support for Ukraine among the US population hasn't disappeared. It is still there, isn't it?
Oh, it's still a majority support for Ukraine. In fact, it's a significant thing. I have to double check the latest poll, but it's a clear majority that continue to support assistance to Ukraine. Look, the U.S. is not, Trump administration, despite Trump, despite these repeated threats, not just J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, we're going to take our ball and go home. Yeah. They're not walking away from Ukraine. And I'm going to tell you why. There's something called NATO, right? You walk away from Ukraine and you walk away from European security. And everybody knows that now, because everybody knows that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he's going to step up his pressure on the Baltic states. He's going to step up his pressure on Poland. He's not going to stop there. And by the way, I need to give you the news, the story that the press completely missed this week about Putin, and I'll do so in a minute. If you step away from Ukraine and say, we're going to focus on bilateral arrangements, bilateral agreements with Asian partners, with others, with the UK. We'll split them from Europe, focus on that. You do that. The U.S. military is not going to walk from NATO, want to walk from NATO. They've been embedded in NATO since they were the leading force in its formation in 1949. U.S. financial interests are not going to walk away from Europe, where despite Trump's tariff trying to break the economic relationship, Europe is still the U.S. arguably its most important market. U.S. cultural interests are not going to walk completely away from Europe. That takes place. The U.S. intelligence services are not going to want to leave Europe and lose a vital part of their intelligence relationship. So the U.S. is not going to walk away from Europe. And a lot of U.S. congressmen are not going to want to walk away from Europe. So there's your fundamental. So every time Vance or Rubio say that, that's just simply an expression of frustration or an attempt to strong on the Europeans, and it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So I think that's a moot point at this point. By the way, the story on Putin, to bring us back to the love affair between Don and Vlad, Bloomberg, credit to them. They got sources close to the Kremlin, and sources close to the Kremlin talk to you when they want to spin a line. Okay? They're not doing it to undercut Vlad. Go check this story, which took place before the Putin-Trump phone call, where they said Putin is still dedicated to getting Ukraine surrender. He's dedicated to seizing all of this territory, the 4 regions plus Crimea, and he foresees that he is going to be able to do that by the end of 2025. Now, that was a bit of chest thumping that the Kremlin put out there, which says, try to sanction us, try to pressure us. We still have the military force to do this, to achieve this. Now, in fact, I don't think they do. And there was one source, again, to Bloomberg's credit, a Russian political analyst who said they don't have the strength to do that. But that's going to be Putin's posture, and we need to recognize that, not the peace talks rubbish that came out and so on. And that's reinforced by 2 things from last Thursday that I want to just reiterate that are out there. Because when the Kremlin says something, there is a purpose to what they're saying. The lower level representative they sent out to Istanbul to lead their delegation, a guy named Vladimir Medinsky. Now, he was the same guy that led the talks in spring 2022 when they were trying to break Ukraine. Medinsky said 2 things that are significant. One is, okay, give us the 4 regions plus Crimea. If you don't give them to us, next time I come speak with you, it's going to be 6. We're going to add 2 more regions, Kharkiv and Sumy in the northeast. And then secondly, he said, we fought the Swedes under Peter the Great in the 18th century for 21 years. We're ready to fight a forever war. Are you? That's how serious Putin remains. And I know we're supposed to be talking about Trump. We can bring it back to Don in the end. But remember, this is the fundamental. This is Putin's legacy project. He's been in power for 25 years. He's in his 70s. He'll be around for a while longer. But this is his legacy project, which is to make Ukraine part of a greater Russia. If you don't believe me, go back to what he wrote in July 2021 in a lengthy essay on this. He cannot stop until he feels he gets his legacy. So for all the people who with good intentions think that he will come to the negotiating table and that he'll compromise and that Trump will get his magic deal, those are the fundamentals.
And where do you think that is best recognized? Do you think that is now recognized in Europe? And is there anyone in the Trump administration that recognizes that Putin is in this for the long run?
Yeah, they do. And again, I've said it before, but I think it's useful restating it. It's where the Kremlin messed up, right? If you walk this back to the first weeks of the Trump administration, you had U.S.-Russia direct talks. They had cut Ukraine out. They had cut Europe out. They had threatened to suspend the military aid to Ukraine. Indeed, they did for a short period. They had threatened to cut the intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Indeed, they did for a short period. If the Kremlin had suspended its missile and drone attacks on Ukraine for a period while they're talking to the Americans, if they had rowed back on their maximum demands, if they had simply said, look, we want to annex Crimea, we want parts of the four regions, in other words, the area that we occupy right now, not all of the four regions. If they had done that, I think they get it. And they get the lifting of the sanctions, right? I think they get it, but they didn't. That was the whole point about Putin's maximum demands. They would not settle for less than the maximum. And that opened up the window for Ukraine and Europe to come in, not only to get themselves into the talks, but to get to certain Trump administration officials and say, let's talk about the minerals deal. Let's talk about the question of security guarantees. You know, even if you're not going to immediately join us, this is what we're proposing to do. It got them back in the game. And here we are 3 months later. And that is where we are, that the Kremlin actually missed, I think, its window of opportunity back in February. And it kind of meant that certain Trump officials who know what the Kremlin's up to, you know, they got the space to, and again, I think it was Kellogg who's still there. It's Waltz who's off at the UN now. And I think Marco Rubio's sharp enough to know what's going on. But Rubio he can't front up against Trump because he knows what Trump does to secretaries of state who he doesn't like what he did with Rex Tillerson back in 2017, and because Marco still might want to run for president in 2028. You know, so there are limits here. But if you then flip it and say, well, who are the other people who are very much Vlad's big defenders within the White House, you know, beyond Trump? JD, who wants to be president in 2028, JD can't go all in with the Kremlin. He can't, right? He just can't, because there's that segment of the Republican Party who are very suspicious of doing that. And Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer and purported envoy, well, eventually he's going to go back to playing golf with Trump and nobody's going to remember him.
And I do want to come on to JD Vance. You know, he did have this meeting over the weekend with Zelensky, which seemed to go a decent bit better than the last time the two men sat down in person. Before that, he'd said that Russia was asking too much. And just yesterday, he said that Putin doesn't know how to get out of this war. You know, JD Vance was someone who was very skeptical of support for Ukraine. Is there a sign in that of not just Vance, but the White House slightly changing its view on the Kremlin here?
It's JD Vance tacking politically for the sake of JD Vance. Now, again, back on February 28th, when you had the infamous White House meeting where he verbally ambushed Zelensky, initially with Trump not realizing what the hell was going on, and then Trump wades in because he thinks he's been insulted as well. JD's reading that at the end of February, where he's thinking, look, our play here is still very much on working with the Kremlin. And JD doesn't like European leaders. I mean, JD doesn't really like European security. He'd given that speech at the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks earlier, where he effectively said, folks, you're on your own, you know, because you guys supposedly don't have any free speech, and, you know, you don't have free economies, and you're just like, you know, this awful, you know, totalitarian area, you know. So that was JD's shtick. And JD was playing a lot to that element of the Trumpists who very much are not just America first, but America alone, which is, we don't need Europe, right? And he knew that. But then what JD watches is what I described a minute ago, is that didn't lead to the US and Russia successfully getting their carve up. It actually backfired in this fact that Europe, again, a lot of people trash Europe, and it moves slowly. It doesn't move fully, but it moves. And the fact is they doubled down on supporting Ukraine in that period. And JD could read that, right? So in fact, there was a signal, which is again on another like side issue, but it's significant. You had the catalytic moment when Pope Francis dies, right? And Trump goes to the Vatican, right? And there's that staged conversation with Zelensky. I don't mean the conversation staged in the sense that Zelensky is genuinely saying, look, this is why the Russians aren't going to ceasefire, etc. But remember that the photo was staged because you can see people arranging the chairs. You can see Emmanuel Macron there as the French. That means the U.S. delegation is in on setting this up to give Zelensky this prime position, pulling Trump back. Well, that's a significant shift in the optics that are taking place. Now, the reason why I tell that story, we'll get to Zelensky, is remember that J.D. Vance went back out to Rome for the inaugural Mass of Pope Leo the 14th. And J.D. Vance, with very warm words about Pope Leo the 14th. Now, why do I tell you that? Vance is a Catholic, of course. Remember, Pope Leo the 14th is not the choice of American conservative Catholics. Their choice was Cardinal Burke, was Raymond Burke. Leo's stance, and he's actually, by retweeting on social media, very sharp guy, has actually criticized the administration, including Vance, over deportations, disappearances of immigrants. But despite the fact that the Pope has had a pop at Vance, Vance played really nice here, right? Vance politically is doing that. Okay, then he meets Zelensky as well. And I think JD's in the position that we just talked about a minute ago, which is the U.S. can't walk away from Europe. Now, politically, there are MAGA Trumpists who might want to, but they can't. And if JD wants to make, the thing about JD is, remember, JD's got an advantage here in that as a vice president, and credit to him, I don't like him. I don't think he's a very principled politician. He's ambitious as all get out, but he's sharp at doing this. He's made himself important as a vice president. And a lot of vice presidents don't do that. And he's made himself important, and he's setting up for 2028. So yeah, to the extent right now that Vance sees a more, I wouldn't say conciliatory, but a more pragmatic approach with Europe as being politically valuable for him, yeah, he's changed a bit.
And just to finish, Scott, I want to reflect on the past week a little bit. Trump was supposed to be away in the Gulf, away in the Middle East, doing the art of the deal, making deals with all these people. That's all been a bit overshadowed now, though, hasn't it? And even at the time it was being, because we anticipated these supposed talks in Turkey. How is Trump going to feel about that? About not just his foreign policy, but almost all of his policy now just being overshadowed by Ukraine?
Trump doesn't sit and feel sorry for himself. Not in that sense. I mean, he feels like he's the victim, right? But Trump always generates any type of disappointment into anger. So he'll just simply put out another angry tweet. But it might not be about Ukraine. It might not be about the Middle East. It could be about any topic, right? That he gets angry about. So I think what's more important, if I could, Louis, is to actually pivot on that Middle East angle, the Gulf angle, and talk about its importance for just a moment. The first thing is, and forgive me for repeating myself because I've said it a few times since last week, the Gulf states played Trump, right? Now, in all fairness, you could say that Trump played the Gulf states because he's going to make a lot of money for his personal empire out of this. Perhaps that 80-story Trump Tower in the UAE with the world's largest infinite horizon pool. Perhaps that $5.5 billion golf course and resort in Qatar that they're pursuing. Perhaps the UAE's investment in this cryptocurrency, I'll use a polite word for it, scheme, where Trump is making a lot of money off of it. Perhaps the $3.5 billion that the Gulf states have put into Jared Kushner's investment firm. You could say Trump's playing the Gulf states for that, but in terms of geopolitics, the Gulf states played Trump by flattering him, by giving him shiny stuff, where they get political space for what they want to do in the Middle East, and they get a lot of U.S. military hardware, which they really wanted as well, and they get a lot of U.S. AI and high-tech expertise, which they really wanted as well. So they played Trump, right? Now, here's the serious point of all this. Another reason why this has all disappeared very quickly is what happened in Gaza since last week. The Israelis killed, I was trying to count, and I honestly lost count, but I think it was more than 500 Gazans in 4 days. And of course, that total blockade, I mean, complete humanitarian blockade, which is now, it's gone beyond humanitarian catastrophe. Uh, you know, people, and I don't necessarily use this word because it is so loaded, but people are now talking about a genocide. And what I would say is that the Israeli policies are at least pursuing, either through bombing or through ground assaults, reducing a population to the threat of death, the entire population. All right, let's get to the nub of this. The reason why the Israelis are doing this is because they're setting up the long-term occupation of Gaza. There was a plan, which documents which were leaked, which is 4 military zones, one on the border, uh, northern border between Gaza and Israel, one on the Gazan southern border with Egypt, 2 military zones across the middle of Gaza. Then you have the Palestinians being packed into 3 areas in between those zones with no freedom of movement, with no guarantee of social services, with no guarantee of lasting aid. It is the West Bank occupation on steroids. And I can, on another podcast, if you'll have me back on another topic, I can explain to you that to you in detail. But what it means is that entire Gulf trip has shifted because we're back to looking at how far could this go in terms of Israel Gaza, and that'll bring me back to Trump, which is the Trump administration's checked out on this. When the one thing that Trump did, it was working with the Biden administration, but to give credit is Trump's camp worked with the Biden folks to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to the phase 1 ceasefire back in January because Trump wanted the win. But there was no way that the Israelis were going to agree to phase 2. And when the Israelis weren't going to agree to phase 2, Trump wasn't going to get another win. So that's when he was going off with his thought bubbles about ethnic cleansing of Gazans, which had the effect of reinforcing people in the Netanyahu government who want the ethnic cleansing of Gazans. But at that point, when he said that, he checked out. Remember that Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer and golfing buddy of Donald Trump, was supposed to be the envoy to the Middle East. But he's off seeing Vlad in the Kremlin. He's off with the Iran nuclear talks. He's everywhere except really dealing with the serious talks that needed to be taking place in the Middle East. So apart from the Trump administration leaking that J.D. Vance was going to go to Israel, but then decided not to go to Israel because it would look bad. Apart from that, the Trump administration has sidelined itself on Israel Gaza, which in effect means that Trump's Gulf trip sort of recedes into the distance because here's the fundamental. What Trump wanted as his big shiny was the Arab states to normalize relations with Israel, especially Saudi. Guess what? As long as Israel occupies Gaza, let alone carries out the military bombing and humanitarian assault on Gaza, there is no Gulf state that's going to normalize relations with Israel.
Well, Scott Lucas, there's clearly a lot more we could discuss there, but I think I've taken up enough of your time. Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Thank you very much for speaking to me today on the Trump Report.
Thank you so much.